The new story of wholeness is emerging. Explore it at newstoryofwholeness.com.
So, welcome to the Integration Podcast, everybody. Great to be here with Leigh Price today. I'm Nick Hedlund. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Integration Journal and the director of research at the Institute of Applied Metatheory.
I'm Brendan Graham Dempsey. I'm the managing editor of the Integration Journal and also director of research at the Institute of Applied Metatheory.
So today we're here with Leigh Price, and to just represent the context, we're in the midst of this series where we're working towards this synthesis lab symposium in Lake Tahoe, and we're going through every other week. We have a research forum where one of these brilliant integrative meta-theorists is presenting on their approach, and we're trying to gather kind of the ecology of all these perspectives that are contributing to this emerging integrative meta-theory 2.0. Leigh and Bruce Alderman presented on integral theory, and Leigh presented on critical realism in this last research forum. So here we are doing the deep dive into Leigh's work and critical realism. So Leigh is an associate professor at the Inland Norway University of Applied Sciences. She's also a senior research associate at Rhodes University and an emeritus associate at the University College London. She served as the editor of the Journal of Critical Realism for 8 years, and her work really explores critical realism and its applications to ecology, climate change, social transformation, interdisciplinarity, human flourishing generally. And Leigh also was a participant in the ongoing dialogue between critical realism and integral theory. So she's been involved in this conversation for many years, and so happy to have you here. Welcome, Leigh.
Wonderful to be here. Thanks, Nick.
So yeah, to get started, in your presentation, you went in more depth around kind of the basic critical realism, which is, kind of transcendental realism, critical naturalism, the kind of first phase of critical realism. And I'm wondering if you could unpack a little bit more about the framework, because dialectical critical realism, which is the second phase, and then the philosophy of metaReality, which is the third major phase, and how that all contributes to the gestalt of what critical realism is.
But yeah, I guess it's dialectical critical realism was really where Roy Bhaskar started to be able to put to good use the philosophy that he had developed in basic critical realism, and he had always been very interested in politics. So it was a natural step for him to wonder how his philosophy could apply to the question of dialectics. And so he struggled, or when I say struggled, it was an intellectual challenge for him, I guess. Maybe the struggle is not the right word, but he grappled with some of the contradictions in the dialectic as we had it given to us by Marx and Hegel. And he really worked on that. He mentions how it was really hard intellectual work, and eventually he achieved a breakthrough moment when he realized that what was missing from the kind of more Marxist Hegelian version of the dialectic was this concept of absence. And so really the dialectical part of critical realism took off when Roy Bhaskar discovered this absence, the absence of absence, you could say. And then with that, he was able to kind of deal with some of the contradictions in the dialectic as we had it at the time. And for example, Hegel has this concept of the dialectic where you have the two opposites and they kind of sublate into each other and you don't lose anything really. And Bhaskar was able to explain that is only one sort of subset of dialectic. You can also have a dialectic where something is completely wrong and you have to throw it out, or it's partially complete and so you have to add to it. So he really hugely valued Hegel and Marx, but he expanded their perspectives. And he always said when people asked him who was your greatest sort of inspiration, I think he once said something along the lines of, the people who inspire me are also the ones I've critiqued the most. So really, he said it was a compliment for him when he critiqued somebody. So as I said, he really valued Hegel and Marx, and he developed their dialectic using this concept of absence. Yeah.
Well, quick question on that front. So, how does that plug into kind of the earlier work that he'd been doing around, framing out a realism and thinking science in these terms? How does dialectics enter into that? Because it seems like going from sort of a philosophy of science to maybe, I don't know, is it through how ideas themselves get generated over time, or what? Yeah, say more about the relationship.
It's a question I had long before I ever met critical realism. In fact, before I even went to university. I remember I grew up in Zimbabwe, and some of you may know that Zimbabwe was actually a communist country. And communists were very proud of their concept of dialectic. And so I picked up these books about dialectic that, one just found. And I remember reading Hegel's Dialectic, and I remember thinking to myself, this is so weird because I understand this whole sublation thing, but I don't understand how it goes from, how can you apply the same dialectic to knowledge as you apply to social change and social transformation? It didn't make sense to me. Just as a young 16-year-old who had no theory, no background in philosophy. And now you've just asked basically the same question. And that's really what Roy Bhaskar resolves. Because if you try and understand knowledge, the change in knowledge, and you're thinking as in what knowledge is, it seems because it's such a totally different subject matter to social transformation, you really can't see how they're related. But if you think in terms of absence, then you can see how this dialectic is applicable. You can apply it to both because whether it's going from whether it's change in your knowledge, you're actually absenting your ignorance, if you like. So absence is central to that. But in social change as well, you're absenting certain social structures that aren't healthy, hopefully. So actually, this concept of absence makes it clear why both you can use the same dialectic for both contexts of knowledge change and social change.
Beautiful. Yeah. And I mean, that really speaks to, I think you mentioned in the presentation that he's kind of ontologizing this idea of absence, right? He's saying that the absence is real and it's also, this a causal force. I mean, and that's, looks like you might have, oh, there you are. Froze for a second. So yeah, I'm wondering like if you could elaborate on that a little bit more of like how absence is understood to be this kind of driver of the process of development, change, transformation.
Yeah, well, you know, another of Roy's quotes is that, the positive is just a tiny ripple on the sea of absence, of negative. So everything, and we know this from physics, that everything, a molecule is mostly absent in space. And of course, science hasn't really had an ontology for nothingness, for space. And there's a difference between sort of nothingness, right, and meaningful nothingness. So hunger is a very meaningful absence of food. Um, and so these real absences are causally effective and they affect us or causally efficacious. And so if you define something as being real because it affects you, then you can define an absence as being something real as well. So this was a massive ontological step, and I think a lot of people aren't really prepared to take that step. It's because it's to say that an absence, there's such a thing as a real absence, kind of flies in the face of a lot of philosophy.
Yeah, I mean that phase of his work has also been construed as quite controversial. There's a lot of people that are very much on board with the first phase of his work and acknowledge him as kind of a, one of the greatest, recent philosophers of science and whatnot. But then once he came out with DCR, that was construed as much more controversial. And I'm wondering if you
Mm.
could speak to that, like why do you see that as, having less uptake in the academy than the first phase of his work?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, because it really was quite, it's a paradigmatic shift in the way that we perceive the world. And if Kuhn was right about anything, he definitely showed us how paradigm shifts are hard for people to take on board, and that often we have to wait for some of the diehards to actually literally die before a new paradigm can be taken up. So this is a huge paradigm shift, and it's also a very scary one for humanity because if you go back to the Enlightenment, empiricist science was a reaction against witchcraft and superstition, and a church that maintained its power without any recourse to sort of truth. And so we fought. People died trying to argue for science as we have it now as a protection against the sort of irrationalism of that was allowed to sort of free play at one point. So for us to kind of let go of the certainty, like, okay, we now we have to sort of do a spiral back, and we're starting to say, okay, there is we can't be as certain as we thought we could be. It's a scary point for humanity, I think. And so a lot of people are, when I actually say to them, okay, so you're going to trust that we're going to trust knowledge that is uncertain. That feels scary for them. They want the certainty of science, of what we call empiricist science. But the irony, of course, is that empiricist science has never been certain, and we've always had to live with uncertainty as knowledge. Um, so what has happened, because I believe that our approach to science has largely we can say it's what Roy Bhaskar would say is a compromise formation. We find stuff out, and we really do learn things through science, but we can only do that because we're breaking our rules of science. And so because we're always because whatever our knowledge is breaking the rules of how we get knowledge. This is very useful ideologically. I like to give this example again from my very eclectic and sort of varied history of experience. So when I was in my 30s and 40s, Zimbabwe went through a terrible economic crisis, and we had the highest inflation rates ever seen, ever in the world, ever. And what happened was that money meant nothing, and you had to buy everything on the black market. So anybody who was literally alive was breaking the law, because if you had food in your house, you were buying it from the black market. So we were all criminals, all of us. Every Zimbabwean was a criminal. And this was fantastic for the authorities, because if there was anybody who they thought was a challenge to their authority, then they just said, "Oh, you've been using the black market," and then they would throw them in jail. And they didn't have to even look that hard to find reasons to throw them into jail. And of course, this is the same with the way that we're doing science at the moment. Since every single scientist, and I can show you, I have evidence, proof that this is the case. Every scientist who finds out something important has had to, in a way, break the rules of science. It's very easy for anyone who disagrees with them to say, oh, point out to certain problems with their scientific method, and yet turn a blind eye to people who find out science, supposedly science that suits them. So ideologically, the fact that our current philosophy of science is basically incorrect, is kind of held in place because it's a useful thing, and I don't think that people doing that on purpose necessarily, but it certainly is a useful kind of problematic in order to maintain the status quo. So all of this is, I don't know. I don't know. It's amazing that we're in this situation where so much of science as we know it is actually not very helpful. And Roy Bhaskar challenges that. Yeah.
Oh, question on the sort of the developmental aspect of this, because I'm kind of looking at both Hegel and Marx at the moment in work that I'm doing, and kind of it's interesting, that they're both these kinds of developmental thinkers, one very idealist, one very materialist. But I'm curious around, Bhaskara's relationship to Marx and Marxism, and his thoughts about development. I ask because I'm totally unfamiliar, so I'm curious if that was an element of his thought of thinking about social development. I know that a lot of his interest was certainly not just sort of thought for thinking's sake, but that there is an emancipatory element to the work that this kind of critical thinking would do, in the kind of critical social science that it would be able to assist. And so I know that that's a big aspect of his thought that maybe had influences from Marx, in terms of philosophers aren't just trying to understand the world, we're trying to change it, that sort of thing. So anyway, is there anything around critical realism and its relationship to sort of Marxist thoughts around social development that you could surface for us a little bit? And the last thing I'll say about that too is, in the context of conversations between integral theory and critical realism, of course, development, both kind of mental, cognitive, but also social and social formation development, is a big aspect that people pick up from integral thought. And I'm just kind of curious in terms of some of the parallels or lack thereof, or absences from Bhaskar and critical realism.
Yeah, to be honest, this section of Roy Bhaskar's work is particularly challenging to fully grasp. And it's difficult because if somebody reads his work who doesn't have quite a strong background in Marx and Hegel, it's very, it's it's a lot of hard work to get through. And I can't say that that is a section that I've worked through a lot. But Marx, Roy Bhaskar felt that Marx was onto a good thing. There are parts of his philosophy he felt that Bhaskar had an ontology for the sort of the certain social structures. So the whole, wage, what's it, the way that wage work, the way that wages are paid, and people are not paid for the value of their work, for example. So Marx was doing that depth realism and looking at structures and mechanisms, and he certainly was going in that direction that Roy Bhaskar was in. But I think Roy felt that Marx was a bit narrow, and that he sort of focused on these particular issues like class, and he didn't look at some of the broader things that are also related. So yeah, I think again Roy Bhaskar extends Marx quite a lot in that respect.
Yeah, and I'll just add that it seems to me he was like implicitly arguing that there are these, in addition to these more economic structures and class and capital and whatnot, that the fundamental philosophies, paradigms, worldviews that we inhabit are actually a really important, causal agent in the whole unfoldment process, and that's a really important piece to get into it as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think if you take Bhaskar's perspective on all the Marxists, okay, so you have all the different ones. You have Althusser and Paulo Freire, and I don't know, all the different Marxists. He kind of sees he does this analysis of each of them, and he kind of looks at each of their philosophies and tries to unpack them in terms of his philosophy and which ones. So some of them go down the more some of them become quite postmodernist actually, and quite relativist, especially some of the Frankfurt School, for example. I think I'm trying to remember. I think it was Althusser that he felt was sort of closest to him in terms of his philosophy in some ways, and he also very much valued those some of the Marxist thinking that included Freud, because that was, again, an extension. Sort of like not being too narrow and understanding the function of our minds and psychology and that sort of thing in our emancipation as well. So Bhaskar includes Freud a lot in his work, actually. And his whole concept of the reality principle comes from Freud. And he himself did have psychoanalysis. He felt that psychoanalysis didn't actually help him much, but he did pick up some of the concepts from psychoanalysis from Freud. And in fact, his Tina compromise is again is a Freudian concept, the compromise formations. So he added those to the sort of emancipatory dialectic, and yeah, those Marxists who also included Freud are probably closer to Roy Bhaskar than Marxists that didn't include Freud.
Yeah, that's great. So yeah, I mean, it seems like the whole Bhaskarian project it really is about social emancipation. It really is about creating a humanistic society, which is, a kind of a concept that he reconstructs, inspired by Marx. And the first phase, kind of does that deep in the heart of philosophy of science and social science, and then he deepens that with DCR, right? And kind of radicalizes it and penetrates deeper into the heart of the kind of Western worldview and critiquing ontological monovalence and that's hard for some people to take on. And then maybe you now tell us a bit more about how he further extends and deepens that system as he articulates the philosophy of meta-reality and takes the spiritual turn and what is happening there and what does that add to the system?
Roy will always would always say that people used to say, "Oh, that's your spiritual turn." And he would say that's the so-called spiritual turn because he didn't really feel that he suddenly had a spiritual turn. He felt that the spirituality of his work was implicit from the very beginning, and for him to be able to say that, when it's quite obvious that when you read, for example, realist theory of science, there's no spirituality in there overtly at all. So why would he say that there's an implicit spirituality? And then you have to understand, well, how does he define spirituality? And so I actually feel he has quite a secular definition of spirituality, which suits me quite well, because I tend to be, I don't tend to have a personal God. And so this version of spirituality is really about getting beyond the dualisms, getting beyond the splits. That's his main objective with spirituality, actually. And so when you see his original work, and he's avoiding like the dualism of, say, structure and agency, or you know any of these in the dualism of facts and values, for example. His work is consistently breaking down the dualisms, and so he said that basically almost all of the arguments and wars that we've ever had have been around some kind of dualistic thinking. And so for him, spirituality is to get beyond that dualistic thinking. And then in meta-reality, he took the step, I guess, to kind of personalize that, because he said, okay, so actually we are often in a non-dual state. And the non-duality is something that exists constantly. If you're listening to me and understanding, in fact, even if you're not understanding me, if you're just listening to my voice, in a way, you're in a non-dual relationship with me. When we're reading a book and we kind of get totally lost in it, we're in a non-dual situation. And Csikszentmihalyi talks about this in the non-dual experience of, like, if you're in the flow of things. So Roy Bhaskar really just this concept of going beyond dualisms is really what links all of his work. And so meta-reality isn't that surprising from that perspective. And so he felt that in our cultures, we have resources, and that spirituality is a kind of a cultural resource that we need to draw on if we're going to survive, the crises. And so he felt that there are some really important things that we can pick up and use in terms of spirituality. And of course, he mentioned things like Ubuntu in the Southern African, this concept of you are because I am, or I am because you are. So there are certain, sort of cultural, spiritual concepts that we can make use of. And so he wanted us to be able to use those resources in order to sort of go forward with our emancipation. So for him, spirituality really was about an extension of his thinking about emancipation. And so he sometimes defined spirituality as your inwardness. So it's the emancipation of your inward self, I guess. Finding your ground state, he would call it, where yourself in your best day, which I always thought was perhaps a little bit of a simplistic way of thinking about it. But I understand what he's trying to say. It's like, how do you achieve your greatest potential as a human being? Yeah. So he kind of linked together our spirituality, our personal growth, and the world's and the well-being of the world and the well-being of each other, which is not surprising since this is he is a meta-theoretician. So it's not hard for me to explain this concept to integral theorists.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I always found it really inspiring that, Roy articulated that the reason why he went into metaReality was because he felt like it was absolutely essential if we're going to make it through the metacrisis, or what he called the crisis system, in a good way. And he knew that it was alienate him from a lot of elements in the academy, and probably be, the
Mm.
worst movie he could make for his career, but the best movie he could make for the world. And I just respect him so
Yeah.
much for making that move. Could you say a little bit more about the actual model? So it's a secular spirituality. It's rooted in transcendental arguments that undergird this non-dual reality, right? So it's
Mhm.
asking you to have, any kind of, ontotheology or belief structure or anything like that. He's saying follow the transcendental arguments, and you can transcendentally retroduce that there is this non-dual ground state, and all the ground states are linked together through a cosmic envelope. And he has a whole tripartite model of the self. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about the structural elements of meta-reality.
Oof, again, I think I'm going to pass on that question because, yeah, I haven't really, yeah. I mean, it sounds to me like you can probably answer that question better yourself. I mean, um, yeah, I've only read one of his meta-reality books, and I was blown away by it. I think it's very powerful. And I certainly do use I see myself as being in it changed how I deal with the world really in a practical way. Like, oh, okay, this is I'm in a non-dual state now, and it did make me feel like life is more meaningful. I guess I also picked up that concept from him. You know, there is value and meaning in the world, and that the world is what was the word he used? Help me out here. It's
Well, the re-enchantment of
it's
the world,
inherent
right?
and enchanted. It's
Yeah.
a beautiful enchanted world.
Mhm.
And so he created a space for that in my life. Whereas, of course, most philosophy, when it's anti-ontology, it ends up down this awful, you become nihilistic. Before I found critical realism, it was really hard for me to even think that there was any possibility of hope. Um, and I was, it was easy to go down this nihilism. And I think critical realism gives you hope. It's definitely not, it re-enchants the world for you. That's the word he uses, re-enchanting. And so in terms of meta-reality, yeah, in some ways it seems to me also quite a common sense approach. He says things like you can never force somebody to learn something. at some point they just have to learn it. At some point you just have to do it. You can show them how to do the maths, but at some point they just have to get it. And that's us with our spirituality. We can kind of talk about it, but it's kind of something you just have to do. It's not that, it's not there is an aspect of it that is not thinking. And in fact, he goes so far as to say you have to unthink. If you're going to develop, to grow, you also have to sort of at some point stop thinking and just do. And learning is also a process of unlearning. And of course, this is all what the great spiritual teachers, these are the sorts of things the great spiritual teachers have been trying to tell us for thousands of years.
I'm curious for you. So there's been a lovely sort of tour through the different phases, and most of your presentation have focused a lot on sort of the kind of the move from, was it transcendental naturalism into critical realism kind of proper. And then this has been a more thorough unpacking of the dialectical critical realism and the meta-reality aspects. So there's phases here to this work. Do you, I guess, personally find that there's a phase that is sort of the most relevant for the work that you do, or the one that you connect with most? Or, so that's kind of question one. And then question two is like, is it all one thing as you read it, or does it really have these kinds of discrete movements to it, or do you just, when you think critical realism, you kind of think the whole shebang?
I think that those phases were something that other people put onto Roy's work. He didn't think of it in terms of those phases himself, but they do certainly build on each other. And I always add another phase, actually, which is his phase of interdisciplinarity. And so I work most in that context of interdisciplinarity. And that was a phase, he worked on that phase parallel to working with metaReality. And he worked on his interdisciplinary phase, unusually for him, with other people as well. So almost all of his interdisciplinary publications are co-publications, co-authorships. And so I definitely work most with that. And
one of those
I think that
the book you did with him, right?
And that's the book I wrote with him. Yes, that's right.
Interdisciplinary and Well-being, right? Mm-hmm.
That's right. And so I find that most useful for my work. And if I was to say the biggest confusion around Roy, maybe is two things. It comes up in two ways. First of all, I think his approach is really a kind of systems theory. And I've written an article about this where, I think that because he wasn't working directly with systems theory in a way, he hasn't been acknowledged as a great systems thinker. And I think that he pushes systems theory into a different level. He gives it an ontology that it hasn't had before. I'm not the first person to say that. But I think that is I think if the systems theorists of the world were to realize what Roy Bhaskar has done for their discipline, I think it would be mind-blowing. So that is what I'm hoping that we can do, is to really develop the implications of critical realism for systems theory. And I think that hasn't been done enough yet. And then also, one of the reasons I think Bhaskar hasn't been as well accepted as he could have been is because he, and this is a theory I've been working on for a bit, and this is probably the first time it's going to be made public. But, if you look at the progression of our understanding of retroduction, for example, and the challenges to positivism, and what one realizes is that Roy Bhaskar wasn't actually working like out on a limb. He was a child of the moment in a way. He was part of a zeitgeist, is that how it's pronounced? Where everybody in his philosophical world was thinking about these problems. And I absolutely think that Roy Bhaskar took a step that no one else took. But that step was set up for him by the work that everybody else was doing at that time. And the problem is that because it was so obvious to him and he was talking to all these people at the time, he misses out things in his work that isn't so obvious to some of us. So, um, yeah, so I think in order to fully understand his work, you really have to understand it historically. And that historicalness of his work isn't really, has that careful historicity of his work hasn't been done. And so it's hard for people to place him. Like, where does he come from? It's like so left field. How did that happen? But that's not the case. He really is building on everybody else around him at the time. And yeah, and so once we see that, we realize that it's yeah, it's his work is not that strange. It really does build on what else was going on at the time.
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean, I think of him as, an integrative or meta modern kind of thinker, right? And so he
Mm,
tends to defy these typical categorizations. He's interested in bridging all these divides, including the divide between analytic and continental philosophy, right? And there's just not that
yes.
many philosophers that even attempt that like that. And so it kind of blows people's minds like, wait, is he a British analytic philosopher of science, or is he a great, world world changing dialectician over here in the continent, And so I think that's part of why he's sort of seen in maybe a bit more obscure way than he should be. But I also just wanted to underscore your wonderful point about Bhaskar as a systems thinker. I think that's so
Mm,
important, and people really need to take that in. I would also mention one of my favorite books in the critical realist field is by John Mingers, and he wrote a book called Systems Thinking, Critical Realism, and Philosophy. And he really,
mm,
in great detail, lays out exactly what you said. Why does systems theory actually need an ontology? Okay, and he lays out that case, and then he articulates the ways in which Roy Bhaskar has done that in a lot of ways.
mm,
And so anyone who's interested in these concepts of emergence and causality and downward causality and all these kinds of things, Roy has so much to offer. So that connection is just really important. So thank you for making that.
mm,
Yeah, so
mm,
that gives us a wonderful sense of, the three primary movements of critical realism and how that all hangs together in one system. And that one can sort of draw on these things in a scalable way. So if someone is just inspired by the philosophy of meta-reality, they can get into that. And there's a lot of people that only draw on the first movement, right? That's kind of
mhm.
the main piece that's landed in the academy. But that's all really wonderful. So I'm wondering if you could now like reflect a bit on critical realism, and what you feel like critical realism brings to this broader table. We could call it an arc theoretical table of like in the ecology of integrative meta theories now. What is it that critical realism uniquely brings to the table? What are its core kind of like strengths and contributions that you feel like are maybe not well represented by some of the other integrative meta theories?
If you look at what Ken Wilber did to begin with, as I understand it, and he did this incredible work where he looked at all these different world philosophies. And I mean, honestly, he must have an incredible mind to have done that work. And then he put it together, and he came up with his different way of looking at the four different ways of looking at the world. Um, and in a way, Roy Bhaskar has almost done identical work, but he's just started at a different space. So instead of starting by looking at all the patterns, he sort of started in philosophy, and but in the end, he's kind of given an ontology to all those different spaces that Ken Wilber identified. What's the name of those four? Equal.
The four quadrants, yeah.
The four quadrants. So Roy Bhaskar gives an ontology to those four quadrants, and Wilber sort of described them. So I think that they're working on exactly the same issues in a way, but just coming to them from very different perspectives. But the proof of their work is that they should fit, you know? So if what Wilbur is describing is reality, and then if what Roy is describing is reality, then there should somehow be a match. And I believe that there is. I think that some people have demonstrated how, for example, Bhaskar's different, four planar social being, for example, might relate to the equal, or people are often theorizing how these two things fit together, and I think that they do fit together quite well. So, in typical Wilberian kind of spirit, the spirit of Wilbur, I would say that there's a space for all of them, and they really do complement each other, I think.
I know.
I would say, yeah.
No, please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that the main difference for me between, and I'm not sure if this is true of integral theorists now, because I know people change and things change. But when I looked at some of the earlier integral theory stuff, it seemed to me that one of the biggest differences was how one judges truth in a way. I think the integral theorists I think they tend towards a more Kantian kind of version of truth making. And Bhaskar has more this judgmental rationalism. And I would say that's probably one of the main differences between the two.
That's an interesting thing. I'd like to, I think more about that, unpack that at some point. No, I was going to ask is, as Nick mentioned earlier, you were part of the integral theory and critical realism dialogues. Curious how that experience landed for you. Maybe not even just specifically around the kinds of outputs or the kinds of synthesis that were generated, but also about the process itself, which I know a lot of people found to be a significant aspect of the entire engagement. So what are some kind of takeaways from your perspective on being involved in that process, and also anything related to that also can inform what we're doing in this integrative meta theory 2.0 project would be interesting.
I was completely inspired by how the integral theorists enacted their philosophy. It was a bodily experience for most of the integral theorists. Just on a very practical level, like I remember being blown away by the whole learning situation where we were like, we were, encouraged to be bodies as well as minds, and that was so foreign to me coming from the sort of British system of education where your body just wasn't even considered. If you were hungry, that was something you kept to yourself. And here we went into these teaching, sharing situations, and we'd start out with a meditation or with music. And so, we were fulfilling a spiritual aspect. There was always food available. If you wanted to go and do yoga on the mat whilst people were talking, that was fine. And it just felt to me like I just thought, of course, this is how we're supposed to be. We are living with a contradiction as critical realists because we talk about four-planar social being and our relationship with the material, and yet most of us are just in our minds. So for me, it was amazing to see people walking the talk. And I know that Roy Bhaskar often talked about how important it was to walk the talk, that was something he used to judge things from as a young child, where the people were acted without contradiction if they walked their talk. And so for me, I was really inspired by the integral theorists who, to me, were walking their talk. That was one takeaway I had. Just also what inspired me was how well accepted the integral theorists were, how well integrated you are into the spiritual communities, many spiritual communities in America. And I felt that that was really inspiring because we certainly haven't achieved that here, in England. Critical realism is still very marginalized. And I think it's fantastic that integral theory is not so marginal as far as I can see. It really has a strong presence. And that's very inspiring and gives me hope. Yeah. And and of course, there were these wonderful intellectual discussions as well, like how does A-qual fit with four-planar social being? Or I prefer to say that A-qual is more similar to the 7 layers of scale, but these sorts of interesting discussions were really wonderful to have, without the judgments and just open dialogue. And of course, Edgar Morin was invited as well, which was wow. So we got to have discussions with him as well. So really, it was an incredible experience, and I just so grateful for it.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, it was really have such fond memories of that whole, 5 year long series. And um, yeah, and it just was such an amazing way that we, felt like there was almost, at least in the honeymoon phase, you might say, there was this amazing sense of like, wow, it's like the yin to the yang, like these few systems just are like soulmates. They complement each other so well. And
Mm,
where there are absences in one, the other one has something to say. And that was kind of the first phase. It was, this very lovey-dovey vibe, where we were just so happy to be together and dialoguing and becoming friends, and that was such an important
mm,
component of the whole thing. And then later in some of the subsequent symposiums, we kind of got into some of the nitty gritty where the rub is, right? And this kind of, as you said, this kind of neo-Kantian philosophy that veers into the epistemic fallacy, arguably, and how we kind of work through that. That, of course, those dialogues inspired a lot of development and change. And we were just talking with Bruce earlier today in the podcast about kind of the post-Wilberian diaspora of all these different post-Wilberian approaches, and many of them have really taken those critiques to heart and seen there are deep contradictions in the fundamental ontology of integral theory, and so there's this
mm,
need for transfiguration there, and then the whole theory of dialectic being such an important part, and looking at these places where um, you know there we were sort of talking past each other at times. A lot of the critical realists were saying, well, integral theory doesn't have, isn't dialectical. It's not dialectical, and you don't have a theory of dialectic. And then the many of the integral theorists were saying, well, you're not being very dialectical in how you're engaging this dialogue, and and it was kind of funny. And I think both of those were kind of true, and we were able to find the generativity in that tension, and I think
mm,
as Bhaskar's theory would sort of suggest, the absences in both the theories, the contradictions between both of the theories were actually these powerful generative drivers of new and more encompassing arc theoretical perspectives like complex analytical realism, visionary realism, and others, which I thought was really wonderful. And yeah, I mean, and I think that there was just so much value in being willing to sit with the contradictions. And I remember being very touched at one point of like all of us sitting in the room, and we were in London, and like many people were in tears because we all just care so much about trying to change the world and help the world in this time of crisis. And yet there was so
mm.
much divergence in terms of how we're thinking about these things, and just really beautiful and rare to bring people together in the kind of way that we did. So I really appreciated, having you there and getting to the chance to do that with you.
Yeah, I appreciated that too very much. And it was wonderful for Roy as well to have that time. Um, his life was really hard. Um, and it was wonderful for him to be sort of celebrated in that way and to escape to another space. I remember him enjoying the sunshine, and it was a wonderful experience, but also very meaningful, I think, for everyone who was there. And I always I always feel a bit sad when people set critical realism up against other meta theories, or because it seems to me that that's quite contrary the whole point. If we're trying to get away from dualisms and away from conflictual thinking, and just to set ourselves up against something else is actually contradictory, I think, to the whole point of what Roy was trying to do. And he himself didn't do that. I remember at times being quite frustrated with him because somebody would say something which I thought was quite outrageous and quite wrong, and he wouldn't say anything. And I thought, why, he I mean, actually, I have to say that there was a that was true in some ways in a personal level. When he was speaking at a public event, he would be quite clear about his position, and that could annoy people as well. But on a more personal level, he was very reticent to criticize. And I remember once saying to him, I'd found Andrew Collier's book, and I said to him, "Well, Roy, should I read this or not? Is it any good?" And he said, it's absolutely not me. It's not for me to tell you that. You need to read it and decide for yourself." And he would not tell me what he thought of Andrew Collier's work. Um, and yeah, he wanted us to think for ourselves, and that was one of his main points about his philosophy. Was that you should run anything that I tell you, anything that he tells you, by your own experience, by your own understanding, and you have to come to your own belief structure about it. And he didn't want to impose on people in that way. He didn't want to be polemical. So sometimes he would apologize if he was being polemical. He really didn't want us to fight each other.
This is a beautiful window into the actual lived, embodied, interpersonal relationships of that kind of these different meta-theoretical communities coming together. And I guess that all of that is something that we can certainly aspire to in the project that we're engaged in at present. And so yeah, it's good to have that before us as a good something to aspire to. I was gonna ask, I guess, to come back to the conceptual though as well, to kind of to zoom back up into just heady theoretical space. The one of the questions that we are asking of these different models is also what's missing, I guess, would be sort of the basic way of putting it. So I'm curious, when you look at critical realism in that broader kind of ecology of meta theories, if there are things that you feel like maybe are particularly absent there, or that could be benefited by more engagement with other kinds of models that might be stronger in some other areas. Yeah, how would you consider critical realism along those lines?
Yeah, I think critical realism needs more work in terms of its application. I think Roy Bhaskar didn't fully understand the full implications of his own work. And that's typical of many great inventors, I don't think Einstein fully understood what his work would lead to. The people who found out about DNA, Watson and Crick and others, they had no, I mean, when you look where we've come with genetics since then. And I think that's the same with Roy Bhaskar. He actually didn't fully understand how powerful, and he knew his work was powerful, but I don't think he understood just how powerful it is. And I'll give you an example. When I was writing this book with him on interdisciplinarity and well-being, and he said to me, "Leigh, could you so we're writing a book on well-being, so we better have a chapter about well-being. Could you write that chapter on what it would be to flourish as a human being?" So I said, okay, well, I'll try. And then, of course, he didn't live very much longer after that, so I wasn't able to have this conversation with him. But what I discovered was that we can't actually write that chapter yet, or certainly at that time. So, and the reason that we couldn't write it was because our science is so limited by its empiricism that we actually don't know what human beings need to flourish. And what I, in fact, discovered was this terribly inadequate approach to science for health and well-being. But Roy Bhaskar didn't anticipate that. He was, in a way, yeah, just like most of us, he felt that, he often say that science, he wasn't trying to change what science was doing. He was just trying to change the philosophy of science and under labor for what science was already doing. But I think that, in fact, his philosophy of science is going to and will need to change how we do science and how we perceive science. And I think he didn't realize that. Um, and that perhaps is a weakness of his philosophy. But he's left us with a legacy where we can potentially change science into something much greater and much more powerful. Um, and I think that's where we have to, that's our job. We have to do that head work.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, I hear that as like he sort of laid the foundations for the possibility of a kind of radically transformed notion of what science is, like an integrative science.
Absolutely.
And also
Mm,
his visions of the ways that we tend to think of philosophy over here in this lane, and then there's science over here in this lane, in the modern world. And they're kind of, they're a bit dissociated from each other. But I think he articulated this vision of this twin screwing of science and philosophy, the categorigmatic nature of the two fields that I think is extremely powerful. And I think that's part of what you're saying is that like, well, to do science in a way that really plays out the implications of what Bhaskar theorized would be a pretty radical transfiguration of what science how actually is.
yeah,
Um, and they were
absolutely.
like, you can't be a scientist without also being a philosopher of some kind, right? And kind of natural
Mhm.
philosopher and vice versa, right? And the
Yeah,
philosophers be very interested in the findings of
yeah,
science and so on. So yeah,
yeah.
great visionary, and that's a wonderful, image of what he's left us with to kind of continue. It's up to us to continue to unpack that.
Mm. And
Well,
he did in his book, Enlightened Common Sense, somewhere in there, he's actually written a couple of sentences saying this is what still needs to be done from his perspective. And, it was quite a long list, actually. I can't remember all the details, but he certainly did leave, there's work to be done. And he certainly didn't complete his life's work. It was sad actually that he went when he did because there was still so much he wanted to do.
Well, a quick question on that front. I'm
Mm.
curious in terms of what the critical realist community is like at the moment. Is it still flourishing? Do you still see it being this framework being applied a lot? Uh, yeah, just I always also come
Yeah.
back to these sociological questions around who's engaging these different meta-theoretical models and in what way. So yeah, what's your read on the critical realist community?
It's flourishing. It's growing every second. And it's especially flourishing in amongst the youth, the younger researchers, which is not surprising. That's where it normally happens. That's where the uptake normally is. And honestly, there's so much interest in critical realism amongst young people. Um, yeah, so I think
yeah,
we don't have to worry about that. It's definitely growing.
yeah. I mean, it seems like when I went to UCL, I mean, and a lot of the education that we got around methodology and philosophy of science basically presented the situation to be okay. You've got positivism and you've got social constructivism, and those are pretty
Mhm.
much your options. And then there's this third thing that's emerging that is critical realism, but it's really the only coherent like response in terms of philosophy of science and methodology. And I think it's an increasingly tough sell to be like, yeah, just be a positivist, naive realist, or oh, it's all just in this radical constructivism and relativism. Those are increasingly tough sells in today's world, and I think, the meta crisis is kind of like also a context that's driving like, hey, like we actually do need to work these things out. Yes, humans do construct a lot of aspects of our social reality, and
Mm.
there's clearly there's such a thing as truth and reality, and
Mm.
our experiments into what it looks like to construct a post-truth society don't seem to be going particularly well. So, yeah.
It's
And
true.
then, yeah, I love that you mentioned
Mm.
the thing in the end of Enlightened Common Sense. That was a wonderful moment of affirmation for me when he mentioned critical. Not only did he mention integral theory, but he mentioned the integral theory and critical realism dialogues, and he said, critical realism's in epistemology and its taxonomy of epistemic structures and its understanding of developmental psychology and some of the human sciences is underdeveloped and really needs to be developed. And I think that's true. And it was so wonderful that he could acknowledge that and see that and didn't have any kind of issue with that. But it was in fact quite encouraging of it. And that's another piece of critical realism that I think is somewhat unique is that he talked about auto-critique and he talked about developing integrated pluralism. So that's, and this criterion of like internal coherence to any philosophy. So philosophy has to walk its talk. It has to be serious. It has to be internally coherent. And if it's not, then it's worthless. I mean, if we're not doing that, then what are we doing? And
Absolutely.
so,
Absolutely.
he was very much on board with the notion that, his philosophy was incomplete. He knew it's always going to be incomplete, and it's always this project that keeps unfolding across the generations.
Absolutely. That's the whole point of his fallibilism, is that we always have to acknowledge that some other information could arrive we didn't think about or didn't know about that could make us change how we do, say, how we understand things. So that is built into his philosophy. So it's a very humble philosophy, I think. He's not making, and he'll often say, we need something like critical realism if we're going to survive the crises. So he wasn't attached to it even being, in fact, he didn't even like the name critical realism. But he wasn't attached to it being his philosophy or any idea that it would, was some kind of absolute truth. For him, it was always a work in progress.
Yeah, I mean that reminds me of like one of the articles that I've been wanting to write for a while is to kind of make this case that one of the core kind of architectonics of this emerging integrative worldview or meta-modern worldview is this return to a neo-realism or emergence of a neo-realism. So it doesn't have to be subscribe to Roy Bhaskar's philosophy, but I think he probably does the best job of anyone I've seen of articulating what that, the basic contours of what that looks like. And absolutely, I mean, without some kind of a sophisticated realism that acknowledges the constructivist element at play and the recursivities involved in that, how are we supposed to navigate the 21st century and all these crises? So I guess that brings me to the next question, which would be, how do you see critical realism being relevant for addressing the planetary metacrisis? I know you've done a lot of work in ecology and climate change, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of the relevance of this, because in many ways that's how you got into this and why you find critical realism so
Yeah.
compelling, right?
Yeah. Well, I've touched on it already a little, I think, which is that I think critical realism gives us the tools to really challenge um, false consciousness, if you like, if you don't mind me using that phrase. But it allows us to challenge misconceptions, to challenge false knowledge. And so, ideologically speaking, I think it's hugely valuable. And it's complicated because, as I said before, if we've ever found anything out, and if Roy Bhaskar has given us a correct epistemology, then we've used a correct epistemology, even if we spoke about it incorrectly. So, so we are all, if you like, critical realists. If we if we're surviving at some level, we're engaging in reality enough to continue living. I mean, maybe we're not doing it well enough for future generations, and that's the problem, I guess. But what this means is that it's critical realism is a hard sell because when you try and give the philosophy of it, people can always come back at you and say, yes, but in practice, we're actually doing those things. So somehow, and that kind of throws me sometimes. So if you talk to social constructionist or something, and they'll say, yes, but of course we don't really think that, that there's no such thing as a rock. Because of course in their lives they have to act as if they are such things as rocks. And that's a silly example really, but still, so what am I trying to say? So trying to use critical realism to make the world a better place. Really, it does require a lot of deep thinking. It's not like easy. It's like I often think the best way is never the easy way, is it? And it takes quite a lot of intellectual thinking through to work out, what's the matter with a particular argument, for example. So I personally think that we have to change the basic philosophy of the world, which is not a small ask. Um, and that was the conclusion my PhD came to, was that we literally have to change how we interact with the world philosophically, and come to at the moment when I was writing my PhD, the metaphors people always were using were about webs, and the sort of systems theory was all about webs and connections. And I wanted to change the metaphor to more emergent type metaphors of spirals and vortexes, and relationships rather than the webs. But literally, we have to change our whole understanding of what science is and philosophy, change our metaphors, even the way that we literally see the world, I think, in order to fully grasp the potential to protect ourselves and all beings.
That's beautiful. And yeah, well said. And I have a lot of personal affinity with those metaphors that you just used as well. And I think that's also not an accident that we see those cropping up a lot in meta-theoretical spaces. One of the other things, just, Nick, you mentioned the sort of neo-realism being this leitmotif of a lot of integrative meta-modern thought. And one of the things that I see is this kind of open-endedness, a kind of like, it's built into the theory that the theory is incomplete, a kind of incompleteness theorem element to the theory. I see this in a lot of the different contexts that make that very explicit. And so a lot of that then leads into a kind of epistemic humility and a kind of fallibilism and all of that. And these seem like really, really core features of a lot of these different approaches, and also things that I think we are taking very seriously as core to this project that we're also working on. This has been really lovely. Thank you so much, Leigh, for all of your work and for sharing your insights and expertise on critical realism with us. And we are excited to have you part of this journey and this integrative meta theory 2.0 effort, and are looking forward to continuing to collaborate with you and your expertise on that. So I'll just say that, and thanks very much. But this has been really rich.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. It's really been great to be here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Leigh. Yeah, really pleasure.
Thanks.
Really appreciate all the decades of work that you put into this and all the wisdom that you carry.
Thank you. And to you as well, Nick. You've done amazing work, and you've been what can I say, a great integrator. I mean, you've really worked so hard to bring together the two ways of thinking, and you've done it so carefully and so responsibly, and I really admire that. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that.
You're here. All right. Thanks, everyone. Till next time.
The new story of wholeness is emerging. Explore it at newstoryofwholeness.com.